Much better. Okay. So AARP has done a lot of work this year on election activities, and we have had two big goals in that regard. One is to be a trusted source of information so that people 50 and older have the information they need to be able to cast their votes and to be able to cast informed votes. And then we also want to make sure that the issues that are important to people 50 and older get the attention and the action that they deserve. And that is why AARP has commissioned polling from Matt Hogan and Bob Ward to provide a bipartisan, unbiased results that can help to inform this election. People 50 and older form the largest voting bloc. In fact, in New Hampshire, people 50 and older comprise about 62% of likely voters. So what is important to older voters is what should be important to politicians. And we want to make sure that they know about it. So I am very happy that Matt Hogan, who's a partner at Impact Research, has joined us. He's worked for the Democratic nominee in the past 4 US presidential elections, polling in both the primary and the general election for President Joe Biden, as well as for President Obama in his 2012 reelection campaign. Bob Ward is a partner at Fabrizio Ward, along with Tony Fabrizio. Bob and Tony are seasoned campaign pollsters and have worked together going back to the Dole presidential campaign in 1995-96. They bring right of center polling expertise to AARP's research. Tony was the pollster to President Donald Trump in both 2016 and 2020. So thanks to panelists for being here today. Thanks for all of you for joining us today for this conversation. And just a few notes. One is that this event is being recorded. For those of you attending virtually, you'll be muted, but you can pose any questions you'd like in the chat and we will pose those to our panelists. And we will have time for questions and answers at the end. So let's get started with a basic question. So Bob, can you just tell us a little bit about this poll?
Sure, Christine, thank you. Happy to be in New Hampshire this morning. I have notes that I'll be working from because this is the end of October, an election year, and there's a lot of polls flying around in what I do. But the good news is you have notes too in front of you. And I want to explain what we did, Matt and I. We surveyed 500 likely voters, age 18 plus, in New Hampshire, so a statewide representative sample. We also, because of our interest in the 50 plus voter, we oversampled 50 plus voters in the state, an additional 550 50 plus voters to give us a sample of 870 50 plus voters. Those are then weighted down proportionally into that 500 statewide sample. So when I am talking about or Matt and I are talking about the statewide numbers, embedded within that are a lot of voters 50 plus, but they only exist in the proportion that they exist in the electorate. The survey was done using 3 different modes. We communicate very differently. Every year it gets different. I think 69% of households across the United States don't have landline phones anymore, but 30% of our interviews here in New Hampshire were conducted on a landline telephone, 35% on a mobile phone, and then 35% we text cell phones to have people take the survey online. Using those 3 modes, we're able to get a really good cross-section of all the demographics that we need to conduct this survey. Just sort of the profile of as Christina mentioned, the voters 50 plus make up an outsized share of people who are going to vote in the midterm elections. In our survey, it's 64%. So just under 2/3 of the voters are going to be voters 50 plus. So it's an enormous voting block here. That's bigger than other states. New Hampshire is one of the older states in that regard. The partisan distribution of our sample is actually pretty even. We have 32% Democrats, 32% Republicans, 36% unaffiliated or independent voters. I think another thing that stands out here is New Hampshire is a very educated state. So we have 46% of the likely voters in this midterm likely to be college educated. That's higher than most other states by probably 10 points or so. And as we get into talking about the survey, it's relevant because like gender, education is one of the big determinant issues of how you vote these days. So that's sort of an overview of what we did.
Great, thank you. Now, Matt, the horse race results of this poll have received some attention already. Can you summarize what the poll found about the different races?
Sure, and just want to thank St. Anselm and AARP for having us. After reading for so many years about the Institute of Politics, it's great to be here in person. So thank you. Just in terms of what the poll showed in terms of the horse race, I think it shows two very different races, and that the ticket splitter, which is certainly on the demise nationally, is alive and well in New Hampshire. When we look at the governor's race, Governor Sununu holds a 14-point lead, 55% to 41%. But on the Senate race, we see a different story. Democrat Maggie Hassan holds a 7-point lead in the race for Senate, 52% to 45%. So that 21-point swing is not something we are accustomed to seeing in two top of the ticket statewide races, and it results in 1 in 10 New Hampshire voters voting for both Sununu and Hassan, which is again pretty unique. When we look at voters 50 plus specifically, this trend really holds. Sununu holds a 16-point lead among voters 50 plus, but Hassan leads them by 3 points. And I think that competitive nature that we see in the Senate race among voters 50 plus, I think really shows that not only are they a critical part of their electorate due to making up almost two-thirds of all voters in the state, they're also critical because they're so competitive. Again, just a 3-point margin in the Senate race. When we look at voters under 50, Sununu's margin a bit narrower, but he still leads by 10 points, whereas Hassan leads by 13 points among those younger voters. Just looking at the results by partisanship, the big driver there is among independents. We see a huge 34-point gap there, with Sununu leading with independents by 25 points versus Hassan by 9 points. They're doing similarly well among their partisan bases. Both Sununu and Hassan getting 94% of their respective partisans, and then Sununu's pulling 11% of Democrats, Hassan pulling 9% of Republicans. So again, really the independent numbers driving the difference that we see. Just a couple other, I think notable differences that we see in terms of demographics. Bob mentioned the education gap. We see that everywhere. It's definitely present here in New Hampshire as well, especially in the Senate race, where you have Hassan trailing among non-college voters who make up a majority of the electorate by a 10-point margin, but leading by 26 points among college-educated voters. And we see a similarly large gender gap, with both the Democrats doing about 30 points better with women than they're doing with men.
Thank you. So, Bob, the poll also asked about the political environment. And so what did you find about that, and how there are differences among the demographic groups?
Sure. Well, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that the political environment in New Hampshire, as is the case in a lot of states across the country, is quite negative. We ask questions about, how people see the direction of the country going. And so Granite State voters, 3 out of 4 of them say the country's heading in the wrong direction. And we see that number all over in this is now the 10th state we've done for AARP, battleground states. But also the direction of the state is viewed rather poorly. So 59% of voters think the state is heading in the right direction. And that's interesting because at the same time, Governor Sununu has a 62% job approval rating. So you've got nearly 60% of the voters saying the state's heading in the wrong direction, yet the governor is viewed quite favorably. And so there's not a linking. And these questions, which have been around for decades, typically link to the performance of the incumbent. So whether it's nationally to the president or in a statewide context to the governor, it's just not the case here. And so people are negative about the direction of how things are going in New Hampshire, but they're not taking it out on the governor. It's other things. And that question would be, very differently answered in an open-ended way. Why? Depending on your situation and your politics, probably. But I think the other thing that overlays the political environment here in New Hampshire, again, not unique to the state, is economics and the stress that people are feeling personally. Nearly 2/3 of New Hampshire voters say they're very or somewhat worried about their own personal financial situation. And that's true whether you're a Republican, Independent, or Democrat. And so that overlays a lot of what's going on in the political environment in the state. And then I would say that because in times of anxiety, people are motivated to vote because they're restless and they're angry. And so what we do see is a high level of motivation on a 10-point scale. Tell us how motivated you are to vote this fall. 86% of New Hampshire voters say 10 on that 10-point scale. And there's really no advantage by party. I bet if we had done this survey back in the spring or early summer, there would have been where Republicans had an enthusiasm advantage. But in our poll, we're not seeing it. Excuse me. There's maybe a 3-point difference between Republicans and Democrats on answering that question. There's no gender gap on that issue. Men and women are both equally motivated to vote in New Hampshire. So there's this hangover of the economy, but there's pretty good ratings for the governor. I mentioned his approval rating was 62%. And that compares to in the Senate race, which is much more competitive. Maggie Hassan's approval rating is 48 approve, 51 disapprove. And so there's a big gap there, but it just shows that the gap between the two incumbents, the governor and the senator. Chris Sununu obviously is having quite a bit of an advantage and not taking the toll of sort of the bad economic outlook here.
Great. So Matt, Bob just mentioned that you've done polls in 10 states and New Hampshire is sort of at the back. So you have a lot of experience of what you've been seeing in other states. So tell us about some of the similarities and differences that you are seeing across these different states.
Sure. Bob mentioned, the dissatisfaction with the direction of the country. And that is really remarkably consistent just in terms of the overall percentage. It is pretty much 75% regardless of the state. So we see that here in New Hampshire as well. I think one other similarity we see is that 50+ voters are more motivated across the board in every state we poll in. And that's true in New Hampshire as well. And for that reason, we talk about how we expect them to make up 64% of the electorate because they're more motivated. I think it would not at all be surprising if they do end up making up 2/3 of the electorate this November. And in terms of a couple of the differences in the state, one I would note is the generic congressional ballot is a bit better for Democrats here than in most other battleground states that we've polled in. This is, we've polled in about a dozen states at this point for AARP. This is one of the only ones that Democrats have a lead in the generic congressional ballot. Not a big one, just a 3-point lead, but still I think that shows that Democrats are facing a bit less of a headwind in New Hampshire than they are in many of these other states where they're trailing a bit on the generic congressional ballot. And one other notable difference, I think, Bob mentioned that the concern over costs and that is dominant and consistent across states. But what is unique about New Hampshire is the biggest type of cost concern for them. So earlier in the year, wherever we polled, it was gas prices. That was the top cost concern. Lately, gas prices have fallen a little bit, and food is primarily biggest concern in most of these states. That's not the case in New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, by an 8-point margin above both of those, electricity utility costs were the biggest concern. So I do think a fairly unique finding there. And the one other very notable difference is we're seeing early voting increase in so many of these states. In some states, like Arizona, 3/4 of 50+ voters vote early. That is not the case in New Hampshire. 87% of 50+ voters plan to vote on election day, which I think is good news for Sherman and Bolduc. It means they have a little bit more time to maybe win over some of those voters they need to pull in their camp.
Great. So as I said at the beginning, AARP's interest in doing this kind of work is to make sure that the issues that matter most to people 50 and older are getting the attention and the action that they deserve. So Bob, can you talk about what issues matter most to New Hampshire voters in this election cycle and how you see these issues playing out in the gubernatorial, Senate, and congressional races?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, the economy sort of looms large, and the major component of that is inflation, and that is the number one issue in some voters' minds. So there's two issues that dominate the political spectrum here: abortion and inflation, and it depends on where you are politically as to which one is higher. Democrats really are prioritizing abortion in both the Senate and the gubernatorial race. On a list of issues, I think we have a dozen issues here. Abortion is picked number one by Democrats by 46% of them. And I'm going to focus in on voters 50 plus here because I think they're the key part of the electorate. And that's when you look in the pamphlet, that's the data that you're going to see for the issues. On the Republican side, economic issues dominate. In addition, immigration is important. But inflation is the number one issue among Republicans and independents. We've seen since the leak before the Roe decision was the House decision was made, and then once it was made afterwards, abortion really dominate the political conversation, and so we've been asking a question. In the states that we've been polling in, is between inflation and the Roe decision, which one is more important to you in deciding your vote? Just to really focus in on it. Here in New Hampshire, it's probably the tightest, margin between those two. But inflation is selected by 54% of voters 50 plus, and the Roe decision is selected by 43%. But among Democrats, it's over 80% pick the abortion over inflation. Women are more, motivated by that issue than men are. And it's really, taken on probably did quite a bit to reduce that motivation gap we talked about earlier, where Republicans were more motivated to vote in the spring or, late spring. And now that gap has sort of evaporated, and I think you can attribute the abortion issue as a big part of it. But there are other issues. So when we ask people what their most important issue is, that's one. It doesn't mean other issues are not important. And so we talk about in our survey, particularly when we focus on the voters 50 plus, issues like Social Security and Medicare and prescription drug prices. And those are extremely important if you're a voter 50 plus. The interesting thing we found, not just here, but across the country, is partisanship really doesn't matter. You could be a Republican and be extremely concerned about Social Security. So among voters 50 plus in New Hampshire, half of them say that either currently or as they look forward, Social Security will make up a major source of their retirement income. Half of them. And so Social Security is part of that economic issue that hangs over this election cycle. And so we have high percentages to the numbers. 76% of New Hampshire voters say that Social Security is either very or extremely important to them. 70% say Medicare is either very or extremely important to them. Cost of prescription drugs, 2/3 of voters 50 plus say it is either very or extremely important to them. And then long-term care for seniors, 60%. The gap, there's some gap, some variation between Republicans and Democrats, but not enough to make it a significant thing that we can say that these are all really bipartisan issues.
So Matt, the poll delves into a few specific issues that AARP has found resonate with 50 plus voters. And at the state level, respondents have said that they would vote for somebody who supports funding for older adults to age in place and for the Prescription Drug Affordability Board that has dominated a lot over the past year. So will you tell us about those results and what you think candidates should take away from them?
Yeah, sure. So Bob referenced some of the proposals that are really powerful at the federal level. So yeah, at the state level, we see that, increasing funding to help seniors, age in place rather than going to a nursing home is extremely popular. 83% of New Hampshire voters 50 plus say such a proposal would make them more likely to support a candidate. And that support and impact really extends across partisan lines with, 70% regardless of party, saying they'd be more likely to support a candidate who takes that position. And we see similar support for a proposal to strengthen the Prescription Drug Affordability Board. 78% of voters 50 plus in New Hampshire say they would be more likely to support a candidate that takes that position. And again, at least 60% of Democrats, Republicans, and Independents also support that, demonstrating the popularity of that. So what I think that shows is, it's in this hyper polarized environment, it's really rare to see proposals generate that type of broad, strong, bipartisan support. So I think, the message to any candidate running for office in New Hampshire is, if you want to win over that critical 50 plus vote, these proposals represent major opportunities to help you do so.
Great. Bob, the poll found some really significant differences by gender. Will you talk to us about some of those and how they might compare with what you've seen in previous elections?
Yeah, there's a gender gap in New Hampshire, no question about it. And, we've seen one all over the country where men are, much more likely to vote for the Republicans and women are more likely to vote for the Democrats. And that's true here. So at the generic congressional ballot level, where we just ask the entire state, would you vote for the Republican candidate or the Democratic candidate? There's a 31-point gender gap. You've got women voting for the Democrat by a 18-point margin, and you've got men voting for the Republican by a 13-point margin. And in the actual races for governor and Senate, we see the same thing. So the governor's race, where Sununu has a pretty good lead, that race is tied among women. It's 47-47. So Sununu is running up the score among men, right? He's got a 29-point lead among men in the state. On the Senate side, there's a net 34-point gender gap, where Senator Hassan is winning women by 22 points, as Matt referenced earlier, and General Bolduc is winning men by 12 points. And so the difference in that gap is, expressed in Hassan's lead overall. She's doing better among women than Bolduc is doing among men. But it's the gender gap has been around for a while, long time, and it's alive and well here. We've seen it in other states. I think on issues, we talked about the issue of abortion and the economic issues. And it's not to say that women are less concerned about economic issues, but they are, in this data, very much prioritizing the abortion issue. And so that distinguishes them on the issue front between male voters. But when it comes to, the issues that Matt and I were just talking about those that affect 50 plus voters, there's less of a difference, right? And so, as we said, there's bipartisan support for, you name it, protecting Social Security, protecting Medicare, fighting for lower prescription drug prices. Similarly, that gender gap, while there may be a small one, doesn't really exist in the same profile as the full-on political context would indicate.
Because similarly, Matt, there are pretty large differences among people within AARP's demographics. So AARP represents people 50 and older. Concerns can vary greatly. So what kinds of differences did you see in the poll, and how might those be different from what you've seen in the past?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I noted some of the demographic differences we saw in the vote, but one of the bigger differences we saw in the vote, which is unique for New Hampshire, is the difference in vote between 50 to 64-year-olds and 65 plus voters in New Hampshire, who each make up about a third of the electorate. They're pretty similarly sized, but the gap and difference between those two groups was definitely much bigger in New Hampshire than we've seen in any other state that we've polled in. For the governor's race, Sununu does 10 points better among the younger cohort, the 50 to 64 folks. But we see a bigger gap in the Senate race with Hassan trailing by 7 points among 50 to 64-year-olds, but leading by 12 among seniors. And then when we look at the generic congressional ballot, which is nice because we have a kind of apples to apples comparison with every other state on that metric, since it doesn't change, we see a 21-point difference in terms of where 50 to 64 voters and 65 plus voters are in terms of their partisanship again, and that is significantly bigger than the gap we've seen in any of the states that we've polled in. So I think what that shows is that especially in New Hampshire 50 plus voters really aren't a monolith and can differ significantly in their partisan leanings.
So I want to wrap up, sort of transition a little bit from this AARP poll and move more to Neil to get your analysis of things here in New Hampshire. So I just want to go down the line. If each of you could talk about what was one surprising thing to you in this poll, that would be great. So let's start with Bob and work down.
Good. Well, I think surprise. Obviously you have a Republican governor and a Democratic senator, and so ticket splitting is not new to New Hampshire. But to see it so boldly in this election cycle spelled out, where, as Matt said, 9-10% of the voters here are picking one party for governor and another party for Senate at the very same time, is pretty startling. It's something that was probably more common in the past, and maybe refreshing to see here. I don't know, but that was one of the things that really stood out as a surprising fact. Sorry, Matt.
I was hoping to go first. Bob took mine. Just to give context, like when I started polling 20 years ago, whenever you did a poll, you always had a ticket splitter crosstab. Like that was a key thing to look at. And that is just totally died out because, it's almost gone extinct because it's so rarely is it big enough to look at. And I remember for this poll, our first run of crosstabs actually didn't include a ticket splitter for that reason. We're so used to it not being big enough to look at. So it was almost exciting to be oh my goodness, we can actually revive the ticket splitter crosstabs. So we got to geek out a little polar. So that was definitely a big surprise. I guess the other one I would note was just, the electricity and utility costs I mentioned earlier. I'm seeing some head nods in the room here. So yeah, but that definitely surprised me because that was significantly different than what we've seen from other states.
Well, if we were sitting here 2 years ago, we wouldn't be talking about any of these issues, right? So inflation wouldn't even probably be on the screen, and we'd be talking about COVID, and we wouldn't be talking that much about abortion. And yet in 2 years, things have completely flipped. And so that's always, I always try to take a step back and look at these polls and say, okay, what's different here? And that's pretty surprising. When we talked about the ticket splitting, when we're in a building that has a lot of political science going on and a lot of pollsters and things, and they always talk about these lanes. Well, what lane is the voter that is going to go to the polls on November 8th and vote for a Republican governor and then a U.S. senator in a very 50-50 U.S. Senate race? So it's critical. What kind of voter is that? Which lane is that? So, it's just another sort of example of the idea that lanes probably don't exist so much except for political scientists, and that individual people choose candidates a lot of times if they like them or they're conveying something that is meaningful to them.
So, tell us a little bit about what you're finding most interesting in this cycle, whether in terms of which races are most interesting to you or which issues are most interesting to you. What are you watching?
Well, I think that the fact, what you just mentioned about the 50 to 64s are leaning Republican generally, and then the 65 and ups are leaning Democrat. Why is that? That's a very interesting dynamic here because you can't just throw over 50s in one sort of boat necessarily. And they are over 50 voters. We often get criticized sometimes because we focus a lot on over 50 voters here at the Institute of Politics. And the truth is that over 50 voters vote in large numbers. And so they are a major factor in anything that we're analyzing. I think that one thing you always sort of see, if you look at this poll, you see it here as you do with other polls, which is you have people who are unfavorable. They've been unfavorable. It's not just in this poll, but many polls since, let's say, last January and actually going back to the June before, where the Democrat incumbent, for example, is unfavorable by a pretty significant margin. Yet, in this poll, they're winning the election. So someone is saying that they don't like, they're dissatisfied with the candidates or the elected officials' performance, yet they're going to vote for them. I always find that interesting. It's almost like the other person's actually even worse. And so I find that again in this poll, it's always very interesting. No one's really that happy, to sort of simplify things.
Right. What issues are you seeing in the governor's race that are, we've gotten a lot of debates going so far. So what's popping for you?
The governor's race is rather interesting because, and one reason why we may have ticket splitters is that he got so much exposure during COVID. Every afternoon, there was a press conference where he was deciding whether or not our children were going to go to school the next day or whether we had to wear a mask or whatever. So we got to see his management, and voters in New Hampshire clearly from this poll show that they like him and they liked his performance. So that's a major issue. I think one of the things that we're seeing, and certainly the abortion issue, I get asked often, why are people talking about that so much? Why is there so much advertising? Well, in this poll, 22%, people say it's number one. But keep in mind that when the incumbent president has unfavorable numbers and people believe the country is on the wrong track, that maybe Democrats are not going to be that motivated to vote, right? Your team's, not, think of yourself as being a Tampa Bay Buccaneers person right now. And Brady's not playing very well. Are you going to really want to go to the game? So are you going to get to the polls? But the thing that's going to get to the polls is a reminder that on abortion. And I'm not saying that pro-life voters right now aren't necessarily motivated on abortion, but anytime you take away something, those people get motivated. We've seen it with the Second Amendment, same thing. And so I think that that's a pretty fascinating thing as we look towards this governor's race where they're constantly reminding on abortion. Keep in mind that the governor, this is controversial, but he states that he is pro-choice. Some people disagree that he is. But so you have a pro-choice governor who's Republican being attacked on abortion. It's pretty interesting.
Now, in the congressional races, in the Senate and the House races, Social Security is receiving a lot of attention. A lot of ads out there criticizing candidates for potentially undermining Social Security and Medicare. Also, how do you think that's going to play?
So, let's say that inflation is your number one issue, but secondarily, you're concerned about your Social Security. If you're a candidate and a campaign manager, you're looking at this set of sort of things that you can push buttons and communicate to voters. So it may not be the first thing, but it could be the second thing. And you're saying, if we can touch on this issue, and those ads are very effective because they have the candidate, the Republican candidate, on film, sort of caught red-handed, if you will. It's not just one of these eerie ads where it's, it's claiming one thing or another. You actually see the person saying it. So they're effective. And Social Security is so important to people over 50 and particularly over 65. And it's of great concern. So those ads in those congressional races are very important right now. And I think that that's why they're hitting on. Remember, if you're a Democrat incumbent and you're getting the voters out for abortion, and then you're sort of trying to take some of the wind out of the sails on the pocketbook issues from your Republican opponent, what other issues can you go to? And certainly Social Security is that issue.
So I have a final question for the three of you before we open it up to the audience and anybody who's online to ask questions. And that is, as you if you were advising candidates about how to go about attracting, attracting the votes of people 50 and older, what would you tell them to, how to approach that, what to emphasize? Neil, why don't we start with you?
So if I was an advisor to the incumbent US Senator, let's say Senator Hassan, what she needs to do is to make it clear that she's not to blame for the things that people are concerned about, like inflation and pocketbook issues, taking that away, and particularly with older voters. And I think she needed to, as I just mentioned, point out that her opponent, I'll be fair to him, is sort of questionable on the Social Security issue. And so I think both things would be things that I would advise her to do. But that's easy because she's doing it and I see it on TV.
Yeah. So Matt, you didn't get to go first on that question either. So
So yeah, I mean, look, I would make sure that, they are addressing voters 50 plus, big concerns around cost. So, there I think really strong proposals we see on costs, especially related to prescription drugs, both at the federal and state level. At the federal level, allowing Medicare to negotiate prescription drug costs. We see in this poll is hugely popular with 50 plus voters across partisan lines. It's something that's finally gotten done. That is certainly something I would be touting in the Senate race. At the state level, I'd be talking about strengthening the prescription drug affordability board, also something that is extremely popular. And again, addressing, 50 plus voters' top concern of costs. And then in addition to those, I think also costs, and inflation related is, talking about, long-term care proposals, which work both at the state and federal level. And then especially for the Senate race, talking about, protecting Social Security and Medicare from cuts. Those would be my recommendations in order to help win over the critical 50 plus voting bloc.
thanks. Bob.
Well, I stole yours.
That's right.
And
Back
you
at
stole
ya.
mine. I was going to say, don't sleep on prescription drugs. If you're a candidate running for office, and so obviously the numbers bear out the salience of the issue, both at a federal and a state level. But I think, the Inflation Reduction Act, which addressed Medicare negotiation, how much do people know about that? The details of it, when you're going to start seeing savings, how many drugs are covered. This issue is not going away. It's starting to be solved, but not solved. And so whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, there's opportunity here to keep talking about it because it is an important issue, but it's also alive politically.
Can I add just one? More? So if you add up the top issues, you'll see that if you have prescription drugs, you have inflation, you have taxes and spending and things like that, it's all related to people over 50, and most Americans are concerned about their financial future and their finances. And that really, if you can touch that as a candidate, it's the pocketbook to some degree that people are concerned about.
And to Neil's point, if we didn't talk about the persuadable voter, but those people who are sort of not committed to one candidate or the other in the Senate race, while inflation is a big issue overall, it really over-indexed among those voters who are up for grabs. So just to put a finer point on it.
All right, so I'd like to invite questions from the audience. We have a microphone, so please wait for that. And please identify yourself before asking your question. Go ahead, Jen. Mark.
Thank you for taking my questions. I'm Mark from volunteer for AARP. And we've all been inundated with ads for, seems like forever. It's only for the past couple of months. And I was reading just this morning that for the Senate and House races, that the dark money is really going to come into play in this next 3 weeks to really push whatever message they're pushing. Like from a percentage point, how much do you think it makes a difference in these next 3 weeks? Because I know I just don't even listen to them anymore. So it could really make a big difference in the next 3 weeks pushing all the ads.
I'll take that. And the fact that I'm just as annoyed as you are and I'm in the business. And I went to the checkout at Market Basket and the lady said, I'm going to kick my television. I always hear that people are annoyed by 30-second ads and, does this all make a difference? Yes, it does. And 30-second ads are on television because they work. And the only reason that they won't work is if voters go and research on their own candidates and make up their own minds and act like the citizens and the rights that they have. I'm the only one that you'll hear that from. You won't hear that from candidates saying that. But 30-second ads work. And people are always annoyed by negative ads. They work even better. So, it's desperate times where there's so much, but there's a lot of these races. We saw this in the first congressional district. This poll, it's a 1-point spread that's within the margin of error. I mean, you could have, my friend Ambassador Shoemaker's here. He remembers the Durkin race where, it was split right. United States Senate race was split right down the middle and wasn't decided for some time here in New Hampshire. So, you could have something like that.
One thing I want to make sure everybody knows about is that AARP is wanting to make sure that people have unbiased information out there, direct from the candidates. So we have created video voter guides for the governor's race here and the Senate race. And you can find that on AARP New Hampshire's website, Facebook page will be promoting those. So just as Neil said, people can hear directly from the candidates what they think about the issues that are most important to voters 50 and older.
What AARP is doing in these elections is very valuable for us. And we're a nonpartisan institute. And we're not on one side or the other. I think it's wonderful that we have these top 2 pollsters in the country on stage here today, because one is someone who represents Republicans a lot, and the other represents Democrats. That's sort of the AARP model, and that's why we partner with AARP as well.
Bill Jennings. First of all, I'd like to thank AARP and the IOP. This has been excellent, and I wish more people have had the opportunity to actually be here. I hope thousands are watching online, and I love the idea that it is being recorded and that it will be available. I live in Bedford, been a resident of New Hampshire for over 30 years. I just happen to be in a nice position right now in my own town, Bedford Community Television. We've had all the candidates in. We stream everything live. They're available on video on demand. If this is available, we'd like to make that available and promote the AARP as well and the IOP. So this has been excellent information. I think a lot of people 50 and over and younger sometimes look at polls as, okay, whatever. But the detail that you gentlemen have brought out has been absolutely significant. And I'm that age that just said, yeah, that's me. And I do see a difference between the 50s and the 64s and guys like me that are over 64 that says, yeah, my world changed as I get older. Financial stability is what I'm looking for, but there are other issues. That being said, as I mentioned, we've had a lot of candidates that have come in. I'm curious, this focus on the gubernatorial and Senator Hatz and the congressional races, they're a little bit tighter. And what's interesting is when you take one incumbent, Custer, she's got a significant difference, a gap between her and opponent. And again, it's who's ever running against that particular candidate. I noticed between Lovett and I noticed in Chris Pappas, the incumbent, that it's a tight race. And you have and one congressional person that is getting significant support from both sides, Republican as well as Democrat. I'm talking about Annie Custer, where you might not be having that on the other side in that particular congressional district. Is it the demographics and the way they're currently set up right now that is causing those polls maybe to be a little bit different? And then again, I might be off because I haven't seen the detail like you guys just brought up for these two positions. Thank you.
Yeah, look, it's a great question. We do see a bigger difference in the congressional races than we did in 2020. For instance, I think there was about a 3-point difference when we adjust for the new lines. in 2020. In our poll, we have Pappas leading by just 1 point in CD1, but we have Custer with a 10-point lead in CD2. So, a fairly significant gap. I would caution that, these are it's just half the sample. So the margin of error is, plus or minus like 6 points. So fairly significant. With that caveat in place, I would note, I think the real big difference we see and what's driving that difference is the results among independents. Pappas among independents trailing by 5 points, whereas Custer's leading them by 20. So really a 25-point swing in the race. There's a little difference in the partisanship as well. But again, just as we see in the Senate and gubernatorial races, it really looks like independents are driving the difference in results we see between the two congressional races.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would also say, these are new lines, and the second district, I think, is a little bit more Democratic leaning than the first by party registration and maybe by presidential turnout, or not turnout, but vote.
I think it was 3 point. I think Biden did 3 points better.
It's not a 9-point
CD2.
difference as
Yeah.
the difference in these races,
Right.
by no stretch. But there is some underlying demographic differences given the new lines.
So I just want to remind people who are watching online, if you have a question, please enter it into the chat and we will bring that in.
Hi, I'm Lori, and I'm part of the grassroots activists in this state. We do a lot of door knocking. Neil knows this very well. I have a lot of students that go out and door knock. We've been very active in all the campaigns since January. Your poll is very interesting as to the percentage of people in our age group that will go out and vote, because door knocking, you're actually talking to these people. We are hitting over 30% are not coming out to vote. And when we're dealing with younger people, we are hearing that they don't think voting is necessary because the country is in a mess. But the older people's philosophy is they are no longer at a point to make a change. I'd like to hear what you think about that.
Well, this is a survey of likely voters. So in order for them to give us an answer, they said they are going to vote. But you're right, not everyone votes. In a midterm election, that's especially true. I mean, the 25% drop off typically between a presidential election and a midterm. This doesn't speak to those people that you're talking to, but they exist. Mathematically, they absolutely exist. I don't know. It's discouraging. I find it discouraging that there's drop off between the presidential and midterm years, because elections to Congress are super important, certainly to statewide office. I don't know if I have a happy word for you there.
I guess I would just note is, like Bob said, we're only polling likely voters. I think one thing that is a little, a little surprising to me is that, given how dissatisfied voters are with the direction of the country and even the state as well. And this is something we see, pretty much every state, especially with competitive gubernatorial and Senate races, is those likely voters, at least, are still really motivated to vote, especially the 50+ folks. So the fact that they are kind of downbeat and pessimistic about the direction of the country has not made them less committed to voting, again, at least among those who typically vote in the past.
And I would add, to those people who are, my voice doesn't matter, or won't make a difference, whatever. Goodness gracious, look at the last few elections and see how close some of these elections are. And of course your vote matters. It's crazy to have that opinion and then witness what happens on election night or several weeks after election night or whatever.
And the other thing about New Hampshire is we traditionally have the highest voter turnouts in the nation. For those of us here, we understand that this is some people call it our state sport, but politics is certainly alive and well. And I think one of the reasons is 1.3 million people sounds like a lot, but most of the people in this state, I think, have probably either had some sort of a touch or a contact with one of these elected officials that we've mentioned, the governor, for example. They know who they are and they feel closer to that relationship. So I think that helps in a state like New Hampshire, but certainly, it's discouraging when people say, that all hope is lost. I find great discouragement in the wrong track number too. I just think that, when you turn on television, you look at Ukraine and you think about all the problems some people have in the world. And you think about our country but it seems like, and maybe our two experts can say this, it seems it's almost systemic now, like in a post-2000 era, that people just are pessimistic about the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think the increasing pessimism, and I think one thing we've heard a lot bubble up more in the past few years is, typically when people pointed to like what's going wrong in the country, they pointed to a specific issue, the economy or healthcare or war in Iraq. But in the past few years, the division and the gridlock is just the politics and just the fact that they can't feel like they can talk to people and they've lost friendships or family members, and that the concern about the political division is really palpable across partisan lines. And I do think that really contributes in a big way to those kind of like consistently large wrong track numbers we see nationally.
So much for the political this has been excellent for it. So, I pay attention to stuff, and it feels right on the money from just the feeling I got being very involved with it after. Can you explain to me historically, whenever we did it the past 5 years or so, in other environments, the polls have been so long. And I just want to know, how does that happen? I mean, I'm not at all saying I think this is spot on, but you know what I'm talking about. I mean, some of this stuff has just been so far off the mark. Really legitimate sources. So can you speak to that?
Well, I'll start with just a funny anecdote. When I was doing polling for Senator Dole in his presidential campaign, we'd have the numbers run every morning. And, it's like, Senator, we're down 8 points. And it's like, that feels more like 5. Yeah, I mean, look, polling's hard. When I started out talking about how we do this poll, it's not the same way we did the polls last election cycle. And when we did it then, it wasn't the same as when we did the polls in the previous election cycle. How we talk and communicate to each other and how we conduct surveys is changing. When I started in this business, everyone had a landline phone. And so it's super easy to get random samples and people would pick up their phone and you talk to them. I think we would, maybe go through 5 or 10 potential, call throughs to get one completed interview. I mean, it's like, you have to go through 100 now to get a completed interview. So what that means is you have to have a pretty good idea what that electorate should look like. And there are things that help, point you in that direction. There's information on voter files. You can't totally rely on census information because, as we said, not everyone votes. And so you're looking to see who's going to be the voter there. So you have to cast a little bit wider net and screen down. But where you see errors happen is when those calculations miss as to what the actual turnout of the electorate looks like. That's typically where the miss occurs. You didn't get enough voters who without a college degree, for example, which was one of the things that we've been seeing a lot of over the last several election cycles. And so now, people are compensating for that, looking up that information to see what the education levels of the sample, ought to be. I don't know if you would add to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is an issue, obviously, we're very focused on addressing. I could go on for a long time, so I'll try to keep it somewhat brief. A couple things I would note is just, I think the issue is predominantly regional and with certain demographics. I think we saw both in 2016 and 2020, whereas at certain state levels, there were definitely significant polling errors. At the national level, polls were fairly accurate. They're both, I think, overestimated Clinton and Biden support by like 2 or 3 points, but it was not dramatic. It was, fairly close at the national level. And then even in 2020 at the state level, there were a number of states, there was tons of polling done in Georgia, for instance, in 2020, both for the runoff and like those results were spot on. Where we see the error and where I would argue we've seen the error going back to, I would say, the 2015 Kentucky gubernatorial race was like the canary in the coal mine, because polls were really far off for that race. We don't even remember that. That would be beautiful, sir. Is in areas that have large share of white non-college voters. We don't know if it's white non-college voters the problem, but there is some sort of something correlated with that demographic, because we consistently see. I'd say we saw it in 2016. We saw it in 2018 too, though it got less press. But the error was still there. And we saw it in 2020. I would argue that the errors and where we're seeing the polling errors are basically in the kind of the Midwest, Appalachia area, those states with larger shares of white non-college voters, we tend to have bigger errors. So we're working on it. We're trying also, I won't bore you with all the stuff we're taking to address it. But yeah, that to me does seem to be the problem area, and we'll find out in a few weeks if we've made progress.
Yeah, Jim Isaac here from Bedford. One of my focal points of technical research is on social media. And I noticed 2 aspects of that you didn't actually address, although you addressed traditional media. One is advertising on television, as opposed to the more targeted advertising on social media. And the second is the use of social media to monitor the electorate, as opposed to using telephone systems, of which a certain percentage of electorate doesn't even recognize what the device is. Or more accurately, they think that is the device they use to get to Facebook.
Great question. We often get questions about media and why do candidates advertise on TV, or why do they do this types of advertising? As a pollster, I like to say I have no dog in this fight. I just go where the data shows. And to Neil's point, nothing moves the numbers like TV. Like you can tell when you do a digital ad buy. I was watching here. You don't see those numbers move nearly as much as you see when you do a TV buy. To Neil's point, everyone says, oh, I changed the channel. As soon as that negative ad comes on, I mute it. I don't watch it. A lot of you don't, clearly, because we can tell because the numbers move once those TV ads are going up. So that is why, you see so many TV ads, is because, I'm not saying digital certainly works, and we definitely see evidence of it, but nothing, still to this day moves the needle like TV ads.
And I would say from the research side of that, look, the principle behind doing survey research is that everyone has an equal opportunity to be selected to take the survey. And the method that I described earlier of the 3 different modes is what we found this cycle gives us that best chance. Social media has some potential in, like I said, we do text to web. Everyone has a cell phone. And whether or not they, would respond to a text survey, most don't, but we have those that do. And it gets us into demographics that we wouldn't ordinarily get. We wouldn't answer the telephone because I don't know if you know it, but if you're below a certain age, we don't use the phone anymore. Right? They just text each other. Why are you calling me? That's so rude. I'm aging myself.
No, I feel it.
So I think studies going into it, right? Because we are going to need ways in which to reach the broadest swath of people to get representative samples. And if, Facebook and Instagram are the ways in which most people are consuming media going forward, then that's going to have to be factored into ways in which we can get people to take surveys, but it has to be random. So I think that book is yet to be written, but it's probably being analyzed, there's a lot of, it's going through its edit phase right now, of how we incorporate that into our research.
All right, looks like we have one last question. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sharon. I work here at St. A's, and you've talked about a lot of issues, but I haven't heard anything about sort of the threat to democracy. So I'm wondering, in your surveys, was election denial at all a factor?
We did not test election denial. What we tested were voting rights and election security. And that was in our list of issues where we asked people, what was the single most important issue that will impact your vote for governor? Voting rights came in at 4%, elections security at 3%. So if you sort of group those together as sort of like the election issue, you're up there with, issues like the environment and immigration. So it's a mid-tier issue. It's not driving the discussion. Certainly not that it's not important to certain voters, but when sort of like, democracy and our civic discourse and threats to democracy, whatever, and they typically pull pretty high. And you get people from different parts of the political spectrum, depending on how that wording is phrased, coming into it and selecting that as a top issue. But we didn't really delve into it as much of a big issue here.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. I mean, we do a lot of polling that includes, questions or messages related to, for instance, like January 6th or, the election, the results of the 2020 election. And what I would say is that it's a very important issue to a significant share of the electorate, but I would say it just does not rise to quite the level of, inflation, abortion, and crime. I would say those are the three biggest, and that's probably why, it doesn't mean it's probably right behind those, but that's why, I think in terms of what you're seeing candidates talking about all across the country are much more those other three issues than ones related to the election.
We asked that question in our Georgia survey, which was, I think, in late June. And we split samples. So I told you about the question we asked here in New Hampshire about when we put inflation and the Supreme Court decision on Roe head to head. We did a split sample question where we asked the inflation versus the January 6th commission, which at that time was very much, on the news and sort of front and center. And even then, inflation was the dominant issue over the January 6th. So there's people who are very much concerned about it. But if it were, as Matt said, if these were the issues that were really driving people, that's what you'd be seeing on TV.
All right. So right before we close out, I'd like to give each of our panelists a chance to tell us, give us some final remarks on what they would like us to take away with us. I didn't get those pronouns right. Give us some last remarks. So Matt, I want to start with you. You get to go first.
I'm going to go back to the ticket splitter. I just think, this poll shows that the ticket splitter is alive and well in New Hampshire, and that 50+ voters make up 60% of ticket splitters. So if you're a candidate and focused, wants to win over those ticket splitters, which you absolutely should be, you really need to be focused on that 50+ electorate.
Bob?
Yeah, I will say, I mean, it's not just because AARP is sponsoring this, but 2/3 of the voters are going to show up for 50+. And if you're not talking about the issues that are super important to them, you're really missing an opportunity. The economy is the major issue here, and Social Security is a fundamental part of the economic message that voters need to be hearing about. And don't sleep on prescription drugs, because it's going to be an issue for years to come as well.
Neil, would you like to wrap things up?
Sure. Well, I want to thank you, Christina, and I want to thank our two panelists. This is great. I hope you're not leaving right away, because I get a lot of questions for you. The other interesting thing about the poll, by the way, it's the first poll that's come out where Senator Hassan was at over 50 another critical number at 52. So it's another thing to be looking at. AARP is our partner here at the Institute of Politics, and this is a very interesting event. For me, sitting here, I actually have a lot of questions for our two panelists, but I held back. So we want to thank you all for coming, and we really appreciate the partnership that we have with you, Christina, and AARP, and all of the members here in New Hampshire.
Wonderful. So with that, we'll bring this to a close. I want to thank Neil for hosting us, thank Bob and Nat for coming up to be part of this conversation with us, and thank all of you for joining. If you have any questions about the event and about the poll materials, please contact Pam Doobie, who's right here in front, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. So I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks for coming.
That was great.